Good afternoon, everyone. If you're watching live, this is a Heavy on Sports production. I have our amazing front office insider here, Randy. Randy, how are we doing today?
I'm doing great, John. Good to be back in front of the heavy audience and hitting on a few NFL topics around the league.
I should also say good morning, good evening. Those of you watching this later or a different time zone. But Randy, I've seen some rumors here, even caught a glimpse of some football over the weekend at Falcons camp. It seems like we have some football coming around the corner. Are you hearing those same rumors?
Yeah, how about that? We might actually hear a pad pop at some point instead of talking about things on paper and rosters on paper and who should be good, who shouldn't be, good. So hopefully we'll actually see some ball. As we know, the Hall of Fame game kicks off Thursday night. So that's a start anyway. That's kind of a glorified scrimmage to some of us, but eventually we'll get to some actual football.
I know I always get really excited for that first game, and then 30 minutes in, I'm realized,
Yeah.
but the good thing about those games, maybe not the very first game, but especially as we get into next week when everyone starts playing, you get to see some of those guys that got drafted and see how they're looking and how they progressed and kind of some of the scheme light, I guess you would say. It's our first chance to see football, so it's always a good thing.
Yeah, I think it's a great thing. And if you're like me at all, I've got a list of 100 people that I looked at during the draft that I kind of had an affinity for. I want to see how they fit in. And I'm not exaggerating. I probably have 5 or 6 guys on each team that I want to see in preseason and see if what we saw in college translates at all. So those of us that are diehard film watchers, I guess we'll get a chance to do that starting later this weekend.
Yeah, really. Unfortunately, we had a few non-football related stories, so we'll talk a little bit about that, but we are going to get into some of the more exciting topics. But one of the big things that went down yesterday was the NFL released, I think, a 6-month investigation, their findings in terms of the Dolphins tampering involving Sean Payton and apparently Tom Brady for years, dating back to 2019 with the Patriots and then again in 2021 with the Bucs. So I wanted to get your perspective first on the ruling, but also just as a former front office person. But what was your initial thought seeing that press release go out yesterday?
Well, I think it's something the league wanted to get out there before the season started. But I think my first thought was from 30,000 feet. And this is kind of general, John, but I have thought for the last year that there have been behind the scenes information, contact, things going on outside of GM Chris Greer's perspective, per se, whether it was the chasing of Tom Brady or the chasing of Deshaun Watson before the trade deadline last year, or all of the stuff with Brian Flores. I've just felt like there's been a cloud kind of operating behind the scenes, not having to do with the football people who should be running the organization. And I think the answer we got yesterday was clearly there was tampering, there was things going on behind the scenes that Chris Greer and his staff had nothing to do with. So I guess I'm kind of sticking up for them a little bit, but I understand that the owner is the boss and runs the show. But I think he got caught with his hand in the cookie jar. And there's 2 points to it. There's tampering and then there's tanking. And those were the 2 investigations. And as we saw, the penalties came out really 100% based on tampering. Those of us that have been in the league realized that they may have been speaking and the penalties may have been spoken out toward tanking or the gray area that Brian Flores pointed out and that the league investigated that they really couldn't come out and say because the integrity of the game was so much at stake. So I just felt like these penalties were solid. They were real. I mean, when you start taking away first-round picks and third-round picks and finding people up excess of $1 million, I think those are the kind of things that hey, the verbiage meets the penalty, right? I think the most interesting part of all of this to me was in the penalty phase is that Beal, what's the guy's name? Bruce Beal is a minority partner with Stephen Ross, and he was fined $500,000. So that tells me and kind of confirms my suspicion with why I started this long-winded answer was that they were working behind the scenes on a lot of things. And they used tampering as their way to extract their pound of flesh from Miami. But don't think for a minute that the commissioner won't address tanking and the whole, cloud of tanking that the media seems to jump on all the time as what, part of the penalties really referred to. So I think the penalties referred to it all, but specifically in the claims, so to speak, it only was reflective of the tampering charges.
Ray, one of the things I found interesting, and I encourage everyone to read the full press release if you get a second. I'm sure it's on the NFL's website, or their press release where they post all those. But when you dig towards the middle and end of that, it talks about the Tom Brady aspect of it. So once I got past the wow, this is a big deal because of the sheer penalty, they talk about not only we knew that Brady, or we didn't know, but there have been reports that maybe when Brady was retired, that he had some contact with the Dolphins briefly about potentially ownership or potentially like a player ownership, GM, whatever, quasi. Let's just get Brady into Miami. But the NFL is saying this actually potentially happened as early as December of 2021, which would have been not only before Brady retired, but during the Buccaneers season. So I wanted to get your reaction to that, and then also follow up to see, is that from a fan's perspective, that's pretty surprising, but maybe, behind closed doors, these sorts of things, obviously the NFL doesn't want them to happen, but maybe they happen more than fans may think. But I wanted to get your initial thoughts on just that aspect of it.
Yeah, I was interested in that part of the reasoning behind the penalties as well. But my experience has been, John, that it really doesn't happen. I think it might surprise people how little that would happen. You may encounter an agent sometimes, and in this case, Don Yee is the agent for Sean Payton and Tom Brady. You may encounter a conversation with him where something like this comes up, but this seemed to me like it was over the top in that there were certain details that were actually described and discussed, and I don't think that happens very much. I know, I got 33 years in the league. I don't ever remember some season a conversation that had the details that apparently these discussions had. So I don't think it's something that fans really, would twist their head and say, wait a second, this has to happen a lot. It really doesn't. I'll tell you what, GMs, and for the most part, and that's why I thought Chris Greer wasn't involved in any of this. This came from ownership and his surrounding cast. So as a GM, and that's the only chair I can speak of, my focus is on my team, of building the best team I can, and then managing that team on a daily basis. It would make me nervous if I had people around Stephen Ross or around an ownership group who felt really no constraints to reach out. They don't even know the rules. They don't even know sometimes what makes sense. These ancillary figures, whether in this case it was Bruce Beal or somebody like that, they can't really speak on behalf of the team because they really don't know. They're not in the trenches, and maybe that's the way they use to have a separation between the football side and ownership. But the whole thing just didn't sit good with me. I didn't like the vibe from really the last year. Obviously, I think it gave credence to what Brian Flores had charged before and during his exit. I think there's something to that as well. And that all got poo-pooed because the league really couldn't come down against that because of the public stance it would have to take on the challenge of the integrity of the game. So it all kind of makes sense to me. I don't think there's a lot more to it that can be extrapolated out into say, hey, these other teams are doing this, or there's other conversations going on. I truly think it's a one-off, and it's one that Roger Goodell and the league really jumped on. That's why I'm not surprised at the fines and the level of these fines with regard to draft picks and money involved.
And I know ESPN's Jenna Lane, I think, reported that Brady and someone else reported that Sean Payton, neither of those people will face any sort of punishment from the NFL. They were strictly focused on the ownership side. But I am curious now, if you're a teammate of Tom Brady or if you're the front office there at the Bucs, now that all this comes out, do you think there's any sort of smoothing over that has to happen between Brady and his teammates, or are they more looking at it like, Leonard Fournette just had a tough negotiation process with the front office? These guys, go through this sort of business part of it. So do you think it's business as usual if you're a teammate there, or what would you say as a longtime front office person?
Yeah, I actually do think Tom can keep distance and do it, with a straight face. I think that's why we all employ agents. That's why, they're an advocate, they're a mouthpiece, they're anything we want them to be. But sometimes they will do some things on their own. So I don't think it's a case of Tom turning his back on the Bucs. I just think it's a business discussion that probably happened that shouldn't have. And whether Don Yee involved both of his clients at the same time, I don't know. But I do think there's some relevant of denial that Tom can have with his team. And I don't think it's going to affect him in the locker room. I mean, after all, it is Tom Brady. I do think there was probably some obviously meat to it, and the discussion happened. It's going to be hard to say it's going to come back to haunt either Sean Payton or Tom Brady at the end of the day.
We want to move on to some of the other topics, but I did want to get your thoughts on, there's a lot of speculation that Brady and Arians maybe didn't see eye to eye, and then Brady curiously comes back and Arians curiously retires, and the timing of that, at the very least, is very curious. And then when this comes out, it seems to bring all that stuff up again. Do you think there's this investigation shows there's any sort of credence to some of those reports that there was tension and maybe Brady to get back, to unretire, put a request in that someone other than Arians was the head coach?
Yeah, I don't know. I think that's quite a conspiracy theory that the dots probably can be connected somewhat, and I would do it by pencil. I don't know.
Right.
It's a little bit of a leap of faith that on the football side I'm not really ready to take, but the timing definitely is peculiar. And now when you couple it with the Miami side of it, the whole thing kind of just reeks of, again, backdoor, behind the scenes stuff that we don't see a ton of at the club level in the football part of the building. So again, it's ownership's people around them, maybe reaching out and doing some of that. That's a hard bridge to, connect with football people. But, we'll see. I don't think this, again, I keep going back to the fact that I don't see this happening other places or very often. So, time will tell. I think the timing of all of it leads you to believe that maybe there was a little roughness with Tom Brady and Bruce Arians. I can't imagine Tom would say, hey, I'm not coming back if he's the coach. That's just not his style. Hey, he got coached hard by Bill Belichick for 20 years. So the fact that he, might not agree every step of the way with Bruce Arians, that's happened. That happens. That's football. But to make such a big thing out of it that I won't come back unless the coach changes, that's not a leap of faith I'd be willing to take.
Sure. It's one of those things we might see on the 30 for 30 in like 40 years by Tom Brady's production company, maybe when he get any sort of repercussions for it.
Right.
But one other person named in this that we'll talk about is Sean Payton, who is retired, at least from a coaching perspective, or not retired, but taking a break away from the game. What do you think his overall future holds as far as whether it's coaching again in 2023, or do you think he maybe sticks in the media a little bit longer? Or what's your overall thoughts on where maybe Sean Payton goes from here?
Well, I don't think there's any question that Sean will coach again. I look at it as a one-year sabbatical, but I also wouldn't put it past him to make it last more than a year if the right landing spot doesn't commit. And everybody has the inferences and the connections with him and the Cowboys. I get it. He was there before. He has a relationship with the Jones family. I'll be honest with you, John, I don't think that's a great fit for Sean Payton. I really don't, just based on what Jerry is and how he runs his team. Bill Parcells was the mentor for Sean Payton, and it even rubbed him to the point where he had to move on, just the way Jerry does things. And I'm not criticizing that. It's just unique. It's very unique. There are no other teams where the owner has a press conference outside the locker room after every game on Sundays. That may not be conducive to what a head coach really wants to do or the message he wants to send. So there's a lot of things like that happen in Dallas. So I'm not one to say, hey, next year Sean Payton's going to be the coach of the Cowboys. Yes, Jerry Jones can afford him. Yes, he might be one of a very few owners that is willing to commit that kind of money. I just don't know that it's the spot for Sean. On the other hand, there's not going to be a ton of teams that are willing to pay a coach $10 or $12 million. And that's, I think, what it'll take to get Sean Payton. So the fit, isn't quite as obvious to me how it works out. And if the fit isn't there, I could see him staying in TV for a couple of years. Hey, I don't think Dick Vermeil had decided he was going to do TV for 15 years before he came back either. So it happens. Time flies. I remember when I left the Dolphins, the Chargers hired me and A.J. Smith was the GM, said, hey, come do this for a year. I was there 10 years. Yeah. So I know how time flies. And before you know it, maybe Sean Payton's out 2 or 3 years, but we'll see. What the part I really don't like is that all the rumor and innuendo now, and I realize we can't, help but project what we think is going to happen. But every time there's any, pushback from a club on their coach or fans come into play and want to replace the coach, now it's going to be Sean Payton is the number one rumored candidate for any coach that's on the hot seat. I feel bad that we're already starting this in August. And there's going to be a lot of coaches that go through ups and downs during the NFL season. I just don't hope we have to defend making that connection with Sean on every one of these stops when a coach is, having a rocky point during the season.
From a media perspective, I feel like we do make this mistake where if two parties know each other, we assume that that is a positive relationship. And I'm not implying that Sean Payton has a negative
Yeah.
relationship with Jerry Jones, but I am saying, to your point, there may be a chance he knows him so well that he doesn't want to get in a situation where there's business back tied to that,
Yeah,
and
no
sometimes
doubt.
in the media, we say, oh, he coached here for 2 years, so it automatically was an amazing experience. But, Sean did leave the Cowboys and take a head coaching job. So it's not necessarily just because, a coach and an ownership group or a team know each other that's necessarily means that there's a positive correlation there.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think in Sean's case, he's going to be able to choose when he comes back the role that he serves, whether he's the head coach and GM. We know that's not going to happen in Dallas. Jerry's had a way of paying employees to kind of overlook all of that. If they pay more than anybody, it's not that important about fit. But I think Sean seems somewhat convicted in that he would like to shop for the groceries if he's going to cook as well, like Coach Parcells said years ago. So I don't know that Dallas is the right fit. I think time will tell.
Randy, you've been on a position where you've worked for one team and then you've gone to work for another team. When you're kind of weighing those two or maybe multiple organizations and opportunities, what are you kind of looking at? Obviously, it's a little bit different from a front office perspective, but what would you be looking at this year as you're looking towards next year if you're Sean Payton?
Well, I think it's all about, we know ourselves well. If we're honest, we know our skill set. We know what we can't do. And so if I'm Sean, I want to get somewhere where maybe I have the bells and whistles of the GM and head coach title, but I'm going to have to team with somebody on the personnel side that I think that's probably what I would look for. I would look for the right fit of people. I wouldn't just go to the highest bidder. I wouldn't just go to the place where I can get all the bells and whistles. I remember my time in Seattle, and when Mike Holmgren came from Green Bay, he came as head coach, vice president of football operations, all the above. But I had kind of been in charge up until that for the prior 3 or 4 years. What Mike and I sat down and talked about was exactly the role that I wanted. I happened to not care about the titles. I didn't want all the pressure that came with it. I wanted to work behind the scenes to help build the team. That, to me, may be the kind of fit Sean Payton should look for. And he probably could do a lot worse than calling Mike Holmgren and seeing how that went from when he went from Green Bay to Seattle. So I know that's going back 20 years, but it is about fit. It is about skill sets, and it's not about one guy. And I think Sean Payton is a heck of a coach. I think he's really bright. He's a genius on offense especially, but I don't know that he's cut out to be a GM. And so that, to me, he's going to have to, I think, partner himself with somebody like that who can do that work for him and with him, and they work together. And I'll just add this other note, and I'm sorry for being long-winded, but I've worked
great
under coaches, I've worked level with coaches, and I've worked as the coach's boss. The relationship was the same, and we did business the exact same. So it's about a partnership, and it's about communicating in every way as you build a team. So it really doesn't matter where Sean goes, in my opinion. If he's willing to work with somebody, none of us are smarter than all of us. So I think it's more a team, it's more the right people, and it's more the right fit than who has the keys to the car, so to speak, and all the power and bells and whistles at the top of these organizations.
Yeah, obviously a lot has to play out between now and next offseason. If it's not the Cowboys, is there a franchise that if a coach retires or an opening comes up that you would see be a perfect fit for Sean, or is it more of a wait and see what happens this season kind of deal?
Well, I think it's find a place that has an ownership, one that's committed, and two, for letting you structure things to suit your skill set. I guess the first place that comes to my mind, and I don't have any idea if this job's going to come open, but we've seen Carolina struggle in the last couple of years under Matt Rule. He also was able to hire his own GM in Scott Fitter when he went from Seattle to Carolina. Now, they may get it all sorted out this year. I have a lot of respect for all the people involved there. But a place like that, where you have an owner willing to pay, you have an owner willing to let you set it up the way you want, that's more from the view of 30,000 feet, what I would be looking for if I was Sean, as opposed to somewhere with glitz and power and a lot of salesmanship. I think Dave Tepper he wants to win bad, but I also think he wants to hire football people to get the job done. So, and again, I'm not surmising that Sean is better off in Carolina or that job will even come open, but that's just an example, I think, that to illustrate exactly the kind of setup that I think would be ideal for Sean Payton.
Uh, Another thing, Randy, that's come up. I know we have the Browns page watching Browns fans live. I don't want to relitigate the whole Deshaun Watson thing because I know it's a very complicated
Thank you.
subject. A lot of people kind of, and then the Brown statements I think have been a little bit. The phrasing they've used, I think one of the words was like triggered, things like that. As someone that writes every day, all day, I don't think that's a word I would have used in this particular case. But I will say this. A lot of the fans are asking, and the most recent example is Calvin Ridley receives a year suspension for gambling. And I think most people would, just from a pure ethics standpoint, I don't think we would say that's the same thing as some of the things that Deshaun Watson was being accused of in terms of how we would maybe uh, compare them to each other. So how is it, maybe, how do you think that the NFL comes down on that? It's just a complicated way of how they have to arbitrator now in terms of the Deshaun situation. So could you maybe provide fans some insight as to why someone like Calvin Ridley in his situation gets a stiffer penalty than what we saw the NFL? Well, we still don't exactly know how that's going to play out with maybe the appeal process, but with the 6-game suspension that Deshaun received, the ruling.
Well, I don't know if I can make sense of it or not, because I was one of those that thought the penalty against Deshaun Watson would be much greater than it turned out to be.
Sure.
I think in the Calvin Ridley case, you're talking about the integrity of the game. And believe it or not, this is a business based on integrity, especially with the gambling and the other people that are involved in the NFL now. It's not like it was 30 years ago. So any connection that the league can make with a player betting on anything of any kind in the NFL is going to get met with a harsh penalty. And I think that's what they did with, Calvin Ridley. They took any guesswork out of it. They hit him with the year-long suspension right off the bat. And I don't really care if it was a $1,500 bet or whatever it is. I think it's more the intent than the amount of money. With regard to Deshaun Watson, that really, to me, is a total different set of circumstances. As we've known, Susan Robinson, the judge, the arbitrator, this is her first case. This is the first test pilot that anybody's ever done with the hierarchy to dole out punishment in the personal conduct area in the NFL. It used to be that Roger Goodell did it all. But the thing that they collectively bargained for a few years ago was to let him have less power. I think there's nothing that would make the league happier than for Susan Robinson to take all these cases and take them off the plate of Roger Goodell and the league. They would have also liked to have had a lesser public, a lesser public event than the Deshaun Watson thing has become, for the first ruling to come down. And I actually think the league would like to just be able to say, yep, that's right, Susan, we're moving on. We're going to stick with your theory. On another topic, they probably would have done that. But because this is maybe the biggest personal conduct policy ruling the league has had in 10 years, I don't know that they can do that. So the rules have changed. They collectively bargained for this arbitrator who's supposedly independent. I think the biggest thing for me, John, was the fact that her words didn't really match the penalty. The words that she used, the egregious, the sexual predatory, the worst that she'd ever seen, but yet the penalty was only 6 months. That's hard. I had a hard time connecting those dots. And that's why I think you'll see Roger Goodell maybe come back with a different set of, what parameters as to where they think the penalty is. We saw and heard early in this case where the league was pushing for at least a year. Obviously, the Browns and Deshaun Watson's people were pushing for as little as they could. I'm not sure the 6 games reached a happy medium at any point, but that's really what an arbitrator does, is usually they settle somewhere in between. So I don't know. We'll know by Thursday morning how the league couches this and what they're going to do about it. There's a lot of things that don't make sense to me with regard to this. I think the good of the game, the business part of it, has to be a factor in some of these. And I think the threats of lawsuits really are just that. If Deshaun Watson and his camp decided they were going to sue the league because the penalty was too large, that really isn't going to fly, because everything has been collectively bargained, and the rulings and the penalties and all the things that come into that all happen inside closed doors. They don't get to go out in the court of law, so to speak. These are all things decided because of the antitrust cases the NFL has won over the years, that these are all discussed and penalized in-house. So the threat of a lawsuit doesn't really factor in. And not to get too deep in the weeds, there's a lot of threats being thrown out and agendas being served. Really, at this point, the only one that matters is who Roger Goodell designates if he is going to appeal, and how that appeal process works.
Yeah, from a football perspective, I continue to feel like the Texans somehow gained leverage in a situation where it didn't seem like they really had leverage, and reinforces that if you're going to go in all in on a player, especially the way the Browns do, you better be sure that you know the full facts of everything that played out, because they're definitely all in on Deshaun, and they're going to be, you know, the suspension from a football perspective could have been a lot worse for the team.
Yeah.
And so I guess in that sense, they were fortunate. But I think the Texans, in terms of how they traded and how the 3 or 4 teams that were interested met with Deshaun and kind of made their pitches. I don't know. It's just interesting that the GM there in the front office is going to kind of ride or die with how this plays out in terms of the quarterback there.
Yeah, I think they're all in, obviously, because of the contract. They have no choice, and they really have no recourse. I guess my question would be, John, and maybe this is a good one for you or fans for that matter. Do you think if they had it to do over again, that they would do it, knowing that the thing that has created a life of its own, knowing everything that we know now? Did the Browns know all of this and were willing to commit, or did they misjudge kind of the reaction around the nation and how polarizing this has been? I said at the time they made the move, as a GM, I couldn't do this. I just thought morally there were some issues. There was a lot of ways to build a team. This wasn't one of them that I was willing to do. They obviously thought it was worth it. I just wonder, is it worth the distraction now? And would they do this again if we could go into hindsight, just for the sake of discussion?
Yeah, I'd say this. I think that there's teams that tried, like maybe the Falcons and a couple others that had interest, met with himself and the representative, that are probably very thankful that they didn't end up landing him, because I think they're seeing some of the public backlash, and that this isn't like a preseason thing. This is going to be something that this team deals with throughout the season, and even maybe going into next season. We don't know exactly, depending on how things play out in terms of more information coming out. So at the same time, the cynical part of me sees the training camp videos yesterday where fans are, crowding in to get autographs. And I think that part of it, I see that, and I think, no, I think they probably do the same thing. Now, we may not like it, and I don't think it's necessarily, you look at something like you said from an ethical perspective, but there's plenty of people that don't think that way, it seems, unfortunately. So, one thing though, we're about 20 minutes in and we haven't talked quarterbacks, which I think is some sort of media. I feel like my media brethren would be contingent, would be very frustrated with that, especially when you watch some of the talking heads on TV. So we do have to talk some quarterbacks. A few are in the news, 2 that potentially with their futures being kind of up in the air. One being Lamar Jackson with his contract situation there with the Ravens. And then the other is kind of a more pressing deal with Jimmy G and the Niners kind of officially moving on from him, but he's also kind of still there working out. It's kind of a weird situation to me, at least from a media perspective. But I'll let you take any direction. But those are 2 guys that come off the top of my head that are, kind of futures very much in discussion.
Well, we've admonished a couple quarterbacks around the league, and I think we got to give kudos to the ones who you just mentioned, mainly Lamar. We've had and seen holdouts. Now we see hold-ins. We see all the ways that really players withhold their own services. And I credit Lamar. He has not held back at all. Now you can question if that's a intelligent play with the amount of injury risk he's taking, but I give him credit and his group credit. He's out there busting his butt every day. That you wouldn't be able to get me to say, hey, that doesn't figure in if I'm determining his value and I'm a Ravens front office guy. I think he is well loved. His intangibles are there. All the things that you want your quarterback to be and act like, he has done. So I give him credit for that. I don't know where this contract is going to go, but you could make a case, even though his style is questionable and really those are his skills that he has, so they have to play that way. I think he may top all of these quarterbacks, to be honest with you, John, and he may get the $50 million a year. I really think that. That's how Baltimore has played it, where they're all in. There seems to be a loyalty to him. So I could see that happening. Now, I surely, if I'm him, would not go out and play in a game, but practice, I get it. His intent and his heart is in the right place. So I admire what Lamar's doing, and hopefully the Ravens will reward him in a way that I think puts all doubt, aside as to their style and their future on offense and where they're going to go. With regard to Jimmy G, I don't know where the market would be for a Jimmy G. I don't think the 49ers will be able to trade him. I've said all along, and I've been on an island here, I think it makes more sense for them to keep Jimmy G. I think that to turn over a playoff team to Trey Lance, and I understand there has to be a period of adjustment, but I'm not willing to take a couple steps back to make that adjustment with my playoff team. So I would have Jimmy G as insurance. I don't really care what the price is. You can look at it as it's a two-headed monster in that your starter gets 25 million, your backup gets $1 million, or vice versa. It's still 26 million. So that's kind of the way I'd look at it. I think there would be a market for Jimmy G if the 49ers end up releasing him. If I'm in Seattle, I'm surely making that call. Maybe if I'm the Giants, I'm making that call as insurance. But Jimmy G is an upgrade, in my opinion, in Seattle, but they're surely not going to get him via trade from a division rival. So that's not going to happen. So I think it's risky for the 49ers to turn the keys to the car over to Trey Lance. Again, I couldn't have traded up to do what they did to start with the lack of body of work Trey Lance was able to produce in college. They see him every day. I think Kyle is willing to roll the dice here. Risky, yes, but I think he's clearly going to do that. And I think Jimmy G his market's going to be dependent on what the final numbers are. Nobody's going to come get him for 25 million. So until he gets cut, I think that's when we'll decide where the market goes on Jimmy G. But those two to me are diametrically different roles, different cases. But now that Baker Mayfield has found a home in Carolina, I think these are the two guys, like you mentioned, that most of the media and most of our fans kind of want to know how it's going to work out. I don't have a crystal ball, but I think they're unique cases, and both of them are going to be fun to follow really over the next few days, in my opinion.
Yeah, the curious thing to me, like you said, the 20 plus mil, when you looked at Baker's situation, that money was guaranteed. If I'm understanding this correctly, the Browns are going to end up paying that. So they had a little bit of leverage to say, like, hey, we're not going to release this guy because we're going to have to pay it anyway. That doesn't make any sense, other than to not have our quarterback be asked about the backup every week. But with the Niners case, I believe if he's not on the final roster, all but about, I want to say a little bit more than about 1.5 million, they take that dead cap hit for. But I don't know how much leverage the Niners have there, because they can threaten to keep him. But if you're the owner, and I would be curious as a general manager perspective, how many owners are going to sign off on paying a backup quarterback if they have the option not to have to pay them? And you already have the significant draft capital that Trey Lance, that they, want to move up to get him. Is that a tough spot to be in if you're making that pitch to say, hey, let's keep him just in case at the price tag to ownership, do you think?
Well, I would have made that case all along. And like I said, it's a total amount of money spent in the quarterback room to me that's important. Yeah. I would have liked to have had him for insurance. It sounds like they're going to go a different direction. I'm with you, though. I don't think they have leverage. I don't think they're going to get anything for Jimmy G. I think if he's going to be traded to a team, he'll have to take a reduction anyway. So that's kind of a big puzzle as to how that's going to work out. I would have had ownership on the books already with, hey, this is the best thing for us from a football standpoint. And I'm not so sure that John Lynch hasn't done this. From a football standpoint, yeah, I get it. We're going to move on to Trey Lance. But Trey Lance is going to have some ups and downs. I just think we're better suited to make a deep run in the playoffs if Jimmy G's a part of this somehow, some way. And I would have found a way to make the money right. Even and as far as what you would get in return for trading him, if Jimmy G is on your roster all this year and they end up paying him, they might get a third-round pick as a compensatory pick a year from now if another team does sign him in free agency. So you're not going to, have to give him away for nothing as a free agent a year from now. I think you'll get a compensatory pick.
Randy, if they don't take your advice and they do end up releasing him, one, is there any way the Seahawks aren't the first, second, and third team in line to potentially sign him? Or where do you – that's a different situation than the Seahawks and the Niners doing an in-division trade. Where would the potential landing spots or fits be for a Jimmy G this late in the game, do you think?
Well, the rumors have been talked about. I think the Giants possibly – maybe Houston with a young guy, Davis Mills. But I think you kind of set his growth back if you end up playing Jimmy G. But the one starting job that seems to be open is in Seattle. And I know early in camp, Drew Lock has not gotten many of the first reps. It's been Geno Smith. that tells me that job is wide open. So I would think if I were Pete Carroll or if I were John Snyder, I would be, like you said, first, second, third in line if Jimmy G does get released. The other thing is that makes sense for Seattle is you're extracting a lot of intel from a division rival if you can get Jimmy G in the house, because he's going to know a lot about San Francisco that you don't currently know from both sides of the ball. So that's worth something as well. So I would definitely think Seattle would have an interest. And I think they would have had an interest in Seattle on Baker Mayfield had he been released instead of traded as well. So it's interesting. Seattle's rolling the dice, going with the guys they got. Maybe they're smarter than all of us and have known all along that the 49ers are going to release Jimmy G and that they would be a player, in the long haul to get him to come to Seattle. So again, time's going to tell. I don't know how it's going to work out, but we have definitely not seen the end of the Jimmy G saga. I guess the good thing is that he's such a good guy and a good teammate that the pressure to make something happen isn't coming from the situation being untenable or ugly in San Francisco. So he seems to be okay with it. Like you said, it's a little awkward at times, but Jimmy G's a good teammate and a good soldier. So I think that's beneficial for whoever gets Jimmy G in at the end of the day.
Yeah, having covered the Seahawks, it kind of like all offseason reminds me of that friend that's dating and they're in a new relationship and they keep telling you how this person's changed. They're not the same as the previous 5 relationships that this person was in. How you don't really understand them because I understand them better than you, and they're a different person than what you think. And all along we're saying, no, Geno Smith and Drew Lock, we know who they are. And Pete Carroll and Josh Snyder are telling us, no, you guys don't get it. They're going to be different here. Like, we got music in practice, and he brings out the best of people in their third and fourth stops. Do you think they change their, like you just said, obviously we both think it's a potential fit there, but do they change given how it seems like how poorly the quarterbacks have performed early in training camp from all the reports? Could they change their tune this late in the game before week 1, or do they still kind of convince us that they know best with the guys they have on the roster?
Well, I think they've tried to convince us that they know best. Hey, they put out videos and have been selling Drew Lock since the day they got him. I understand why they might be trying to do that, but I look at film a lot, and I don't think my eyes lie. I know what happened in Denver. I know what happened when his development stalled. I know what happened to the last staff in Denver when he was the starting quarterback. I also know that Denver themselves signed Teddy Bridgewater, who is, not really a starting quarterback at this point in his career, and he beat Drew Lock out. So that should tell me a little bit as well. I don't know. I mean, I understand that Pete and John have earned this over the last decade of an unprecedented run of success. I get it. This would just be a risk that would be hard for me to take. And again, that's just my opinion. Maybe they are to be commended. Maybe they have things sorted out. They got a new offense last year run by Shane Waldron that to me stumbled and sputtered. And, now they don't have Russell Wilson, and who was a guy that most thought could piece it all together. I just think they're reaching right now and really are putting all their eggs into the Geno and Drew basket, or they're waiting for 2023 to draft one. That is a giant leap of faith, which most GMs would say that's so far away, I don't even want to consider that. Sounds like John and Pete are willing to wait to solve it if they don't have it in the building already.
Yeah, I couldn't be more fascinated to see how the Seahawks and Broncos situations play out, because I think both parties are trying to prove to the other one that we got it figured out. Russ is saying, hey, I can throw it 60 times a game. I'm a new person. I'm in, the best shape of everyone's in the best shape of their life in training camp. I don't know if you've picked up on that from the press conferences. Yeah. And then you've got Pete and John saying, well, we don't need a, $50 million quarterback. We're going to go in the bargain bin, and we're going to Geno Smith or Drew Lock, and we're going to make the playoffs. And I think both of them, whether they know it or not, are trying to prove that they can do it without that other, person.
Hey, guess what, John? We don't have to wait long, because guess when they play? Week 1.
Exactly right. And I like how Russ is trying to say he's trying to make it, quote, not emotional. Well, good luck with that when the music hits. But I don't know. Have you watched any of the 2023 guys? Is there a guy that could fit the Seahawks kind of brand there? It's kind of, I know it's really early in the process.
I have not, and I would like to see some of it play out. I know a lot of people who made mistakes last year in kind of evaluating the quarterbacks early on in the season, and it turned out not to be so. So I do not know, and that's not a cop-out. I just haven't taken the time to look at some of these guys on tape. obviously I've heard the names that are being tossed around by some of the draft gurus, but I have not dug in myself.
I would just say I was at the Bama Pro Day leading up to this previous draft, and at the end of it, Bryce Young threw, and I was just so surprised about how small he is. And I'm not someone that has like, but he's just very small when you look at, and I'm around, the other quarterbacks that you go to training camp and you look at him, and I'm just curious how that plays out. Obviously, this season will go a lot into it, but that's something to monitor.
Yeah, criteria matters, John, and not a lot of NFL teams are looking for 5'10", 175 pounds. They're really not. So that bit a lot of analysts last year when they kind of over-evaluated some of the smaller guys that were involved, and they didn't get picked. But I guess the somewhat success of a Kyler Murray or somebody with lesser physical, framework, now we think that's okay. But trust me, it's not in most circles in the NFL. So you're exactly right with regard to the Alabama quarterback. That would concern me too.
You brought up Kyler. I want to get to his very unique situation with his contract, but have you ever been in a situation where behind closed doors, you as a front office viewed a quarterback as a bridge year? Like we talk about that in the media. Is that a real thing where that this guy, despite how they're selling, the Seahawks may be selling Drew Lock and Geno Smith, and the Panthers are selling Sam Darnold and Baker Mayfield, and we've got other spots where the Giants have Daniel Jones. Obviously, they're trying to do kind of a not rebuild, but a revitalization process with the new coaching staff. But have you ever been in that situation where really that this is kind of a one-year fix?
Without a doubt, it happens. And I think that's why you've got to kind of take with a grain of salt some of the things that get said in these buildings. I was in exactly that situation in Miami my last year, where we had made a trade for the quarterback from the Rams. I can't think of his name. He was Kurt Warner before Kurt Warner with the Rams. Trent Green. Yeah. We traded for Trent Green, and we're going to make him the bridge. We drafted a quarterback in the second round, John Beck, and we thought if this doesn't work, we'll at least have a chance to come back the following year. And guess how that worked out? We went 1-15, and everybody got fired. Yeah. So you can make a long-term plan for a quarterback, but things change. And I guess maybe that's what makes me a little nervous about what Seattle's doing, is if they do have a disastrous year, what happens next? Right. We all know ownership is not the most – they may be on board initially, but when you lose 10 or 12 games, that changes everything. So that's the risk that I don't know associates with trying to use it as a one-year bridge. The same thing happened in Denver last year with their coaching staff. And when they decided to go with Teddy Bridgewater or Drew Lock, they thought, well, we'll fix it the following year. They all got fired. So it's a hard one to overcome. It's a production-oriented business. And to say you're going to fix your quarterback a year or a year and a half out, that's a hard one. Fans don't understand that either.
I have another predicament for you, Randy. And one is that when I look at how the Cardinals just paid Kyler Murray, they're talking with their money that they have a lot of faith in him. When I see things like what happened with the weird study hall clause, or however you wanted to call it, that seems odd to me from just a media fan perspective, not something that I see a lot. Maybe, again, we go back to the Brady thing. Maybe it happens more than I think, and we just don't see the contract details. But was that surprising at all, how that whole thing shook out as far as his contract and some of the wording with that?
It was not only surprising to me, John, it was shocking. And I went back before I even made a comment on it, and I've done hundreds and hundreds of NFL contracts. Never once had I ever even thought about this. I hadn't seen it anywhere else. I just don't know why you would lay your quarterback out like that and open him up for criticism. There's been a lot of analysts and people weigh in on really some issues they had with Kyler Murray anyway, and this just kind of confirmed that. So I thought it embarrassed the kid. I didn't think it should have been a part of it. And least of all, not for 4 hours a week. We went through all of this discussion for a week on what this meant for 4 measly hours of film. Right. Hey, I use this as a comparison. Phillip Rivers in San Diego, who I was with for 10 years, outfitted a van so he could continue to live in San Diego while the team was in LA. And he knew he would have 4 hours a day in that van. He outfitted the van with video equipment so he could watch up 2 hours, back 2 hours. That's 4 hours a day. And nobody asked him to do this. He didn't have a clause in his contract. But that's the difference. 4 hours is nothing. If we're going to lay our quarterback out like this, I think it's a mistake to do it anyway. But nobody won from it. If we're going to do it, let's do it for 15 hours a week or something that really there was some reward at the end of it. 4 hours of film based on what they've put as criteria as to the quality of what he had to do to watch this film and get paid for, that was shocking and amateurish. And we've had this discussion with people around us our whole lives, but it's usually with an eighth grader at the dinner table. And this doesn't reflect well on anybody. So yeah, it was crazy. And then now we know they've taken it out. My next question is, the money that was attached to it, where did that go? Did they give it to him? Did they put it in another clause somewhere else in their contract? Did they?
Good question.
Yeah, did they make it part of the base? I don't know. I'd be interested to know where that money went and how it reflects in the new contract, because you don't just get to take out a clause. You have to sign a whole new contract when you do that. So I'd like to know where that money ended up. Just, I guess the negotiator in me wants to connect all the dots.
Yeah, and this brings up a good point, because I think anytime as a fan, if you're reading any report you read, I think you should be asking yourself where this information is coming from. And hopefully a good reporter is getting it from both sides. But usually when you see a report, you can very easily, I don't want to say very easily, but it's pretty clear where the information is flowing. So to your point, there's a complete lack of awareness by the Cardinals, where they're like, we're so surprised that this could be a controversy, and they just didn't have any sort of awareness in this, or this, because there's no way the agent's leaking this to the. No, there's no advantage for the agent to leak this to the media. So to me, it seems like it would come either a reporter doing good due diligence, or the team was purposefully putting this information out to try to make a point to Kyler.
Right.
I mean, to me, those seem like the two possibilities. I don't know why else they would do that.
And they're both bad case scenarios, in my opinion. Right. On the team, I surely don't want that out there, because, like I said, a lot of people were critical of Kyler and his development, and for various reasons. This just kind of confirms some of the questions that people had about him, the fact that they put it in there. So, yeah, I don't know how it leaked out. I don't know why it leaked out. I wouldn't want any part of it. I would avoid this at all costs. I'll tell you what I thought of the whole contract negotiation with Kyler in general. I thought it was a doubling down, John, on Cliff Kingsbury and the program. That I thought this was. I don't see the progress that Kyler has made. I don't think he deserved this deal from what he's done on the field. I understand the upside. I understand the talent, without a doubt. But I thought this was a doubling down on Cliff, his offensive scheme, his system, to give him the quarterback that he chose. And now there's no question in the next couple of years who the guy is going to be. I just thought it was all – I think the pressure's on Cliff, to be honest with you. That's who I think the pressure's on this year. As we've known, they've failed and faded in the last few years. They faded at Texas Tech under Cliff as well. So that's the auspices of how the whole thing generates, and how we need to judge this contract going forward. I think there's just as much pressure, if not more, on Cliff Kingsbury, and this is a referendum on him as a head coach as much as anything.
There's two things, Reddy. We've talked about my extensive Madden GM resume, which is pretty impressive. Many people talk about it. But there's two things I've never understood about particularly quarterback negotiations. One is we've kind of changed this philosophy. We saw the Cardinals move on from Josh Rosen after a year, and other teams have done similar, not after a year, but similar type deals, where if you draft a quarterback, it seems like franchises will lock into guys for that second deal. So you're looking at 7-8 years potentially for a quarterback that you don't think is very good. And that seems to be changing if you don't see the production on the field. But the second thing is, it seems like no matter who the quarterback is, you have to get paid more than the last quarterback. But there's no rhyme or reason why, other than the draft class and when your contract ends. And there's like a hierarchy in terms of rankings or ratings that the next quarterback up. But it does seem like NFL teams and agents and the whole thing think that just because you're the next quarterback, you should be the highest paid quarterback. Is that a tough spot to be in a front office, when I'm sure agents are saying, hey, we'll look back at, this contract, and I'm sure Russell Wilson is going to use that same logic. Lamar is going to use that same logic, guys that are coming up here for new deals. But that seems like a tough spot to be in as a GM, when that quarterback may not be better than that last guy that got the new deal.
I think it's all part of the process of negotiating. I agree with you. I think there's been a lack of teams being willing to stand up for what they think and how they value their own players, because they don't want to be criticized publicly. I think that's always a factor. Being a guy that kind of grew up in the business, that didn't bother me. That didn't dictate how we valued our players, and we were going to stick to that no matter what the public outcry was. But it seems to me like there's a lot of these teams that don't want to be criticized. They're afraid of a holdout. They're afraid of something getting ugly. The player's not going anywhere unless you decide to move him at the end of the day. You're not under any obligation to have to trade him or have to pay him. And Kyler is an exact example of what you're talking about. They had his control of his rights and contract for 2 more years. Why they decided to do it now, I have no idea. They weren't pressed to do that. Yeah, he sent for lack of a better term, a ransom letter to them from his agent, a few months ago, and they kind of bid on it and said, hey, we better get this taken care of. Well, we all know, again, in that case, that Cliff has the same agent as Kyler. There's a conflict of interest there as well. So, I don't buy that you have to make the next guy in line to answer your question the highest. I don't get it. I think we've seen a little bit of that come back to earth with regard to the receiver market. But then again, one agent had the top receivers this year, in Tory Dandy. So there's a lot of negotiating stances on prior deals, but it's up to the team what they pay or not. So, I just think you got to stick to your guns. And I think I see less of that. But then again, that takes me down a whole nother rat hole of hold-ins versus holdouts. Some teams are okay with all this hold-in talk, and I would struggle with that too. To have a player in camp with a baseball cap on and refusing to practice, he's really withholding services. It's the same as the old holdout. It just cosmetically looks different. I'm not for that either. It'll be interesting to see if that gets taken out of the next CBA as well, where they close the loophole. They closed the holdout loophole. Now they're going to probably have to look at closing the hold-in loophole as well.
Randy, I do want to hit the receiver topic before we have to head out, but I did have one question. And I hear the imaginary Ravens fans asking me, is there a scenario where this doesn't end with Lamar Jackson signing a deal? Is there a scenario where he plays elsewhere eventually, or do you see this eventually, whether it gets ugly or gets worse before it gets better, where it's going to finally resolve itself there in Baltimore?
Well, I think the negotiation itself, John, has been one that I think is the most fascinating of any negotiation, and this includes Dak Prescott's 3-year negotiation. I think it's the most interesting of any of the last 8 or 10 years in the NFL because of the fact that his style differs, his skill set differs. The Ravens have been all in on this, and they've made no other option plans. For me, if I was the Ravens, I would have had another option. I would not want – the worst deals I made as a GM were the ones I made when I had no options. And the Ravens look to me like they backed themselves in a corner and they have no option. So they have to pay him. And that's not – I'm not saying anything bad about Lamar. I get it. I'd want him as well. But they've done nothing to further the cause by giving themselves a fallback position at all. So no, to answer your question, I don't think it ever ends with him going elsewhere because the Ravens have no option. They have to have him, and to that end, they have to pay him. So I think it's a matter of Lamar names his number. At some point, he's going to get it. And maybe he waits till we all know that deadlines spur actions when negotiating. Maybe it's the week of the opener. He doesn't play at all in preseason, but it's the week of the regular season opener when this deal comes out.
And you said, though, if you're him, if you don't have a deal by week 1, you're not suiting up. If it was you, obviously you're not Lamar Jackson, but
I'm not. No.
Shocking and breaking news here.
I thought I missed something there. It was breaking news. Yeah, no, I would not put myself out there. I definitely wouldn't do it in preseason. And if I'm the Ravens, I don't want him out there in preseason.
Yeah.
And I definitely am not playing in the regular season. If I have to walk out, I have to walk out. But there's some CBA stipulations involved in that as well. But eventually he's going to get paid. And I don't know what the Ravens are trying to would really motivate them to not pay him because they've done nothing to give themselves any other options.
Yeah. Randy, to end our show, I'm going to give you a choose your own adventure, and it involves receivers. And you can talk about all of them. You can talk about the one that you feel most passionate about. But just to recap for fans listening, and thank you for sticking along to all of our family members that are still with us. But we have Julio Jones signed with the Bucs, heading into training camp. DK Metcalf just signed an extension. I know you had some strong thoughts leading into that negotiation that we talked about last couple of shows. We had Deebo Samuel sign an extension as well. I'm sure there's a couple other receivers that I've been in the news that I'm leaving out. But what is any of those topics interesting to you in particular, or any other receivers kind of in the news with just the escalating price of a star receiver now in the NFL?
Well, the price has escalated. There's no doubt. The number of 20+ million per year receivers has about tripled since this time last year. I understand it. I guess what I take away from all of these signings, and it's really the most recent takeaway, is whether it's A.J. Brown or McLaurin in Washington or Metcalf in Seattle or Deebo in San Francisco, it tells me you do not have to draft a receiver in the first round to get a really good player, because all these guys are second and third round picks.
Yeah.
And the Steelers have made a living doing that. Kevin Colbert has drafted, I think, 3 second-round receivers over the last 10 years, all of which have turned out pretty dang good. So I think that might be the moral to the story, is that you do not have to draft a receiver that high to get what you want. And so, I think the numbers have gone up. I think Devontae Adams and Tyreek Hill are totally a different category than these 4 young guys that have signed. So, hey, each to his own. You got to divide up your salary cap pie as you want. I think I'd rather pay 20 plus than 30 million if I was a GM writing checks. That's for sure.
Yeah.
So I might be interested in drafting a receiver every year. You know how years they always said, let's draft a quarterback every year just to have one. Yeah. I might start drafting receivers in the second or third round every year too, just to make sure we have one developing, so that we would have options, so that we would have choices. You see these teams that have paid these guys recently, whether it's McLaurin or Metcalf or Debo, they don't have a lot of options, and therefore they have to pay. So I'm going to always give myself options, and if not, I'm going to have to pay the piper and pay the guy I have.
It does seem like, to your point, the receiver situation in terms of draft capital is leaning a little bit more towards running backs, and that you don't have to take a guy in the first round. But the main difference is that these guys are getting massive second deals, third deals.
Where running backs
are not getting those sort of deals anymore.
That's right.
But Julio's fit with the Bucs, how did you like? Do you think that, I know it's a big name, do you think that we could see something maybe not quite what we saw his 10 years with the Falcons, but can he make a difference there on that roster, do you think?
I think as a spot player, maybe. I wouldn't consider him a vital cog in their passing game. I think maybe he gives him a little lift till Godwin is 100%. But his health has been an issue the last 2 or 3 years. Yeah. I don't see that being a big signing other than a name, like you say. And maybe he'll be on the same page with Tom Brady sooner because of the veteran experience. But I don't think he's a difference maker at this point in his career. So I didn't read a lot into that particular signing.
Right. This has been fun. Anything we didn't cover that you'd like to just get off your chest? Anything after our close to an hour conversation that we didn't hit that you want?
Yeah, I'm sorry to be so long-winded.
No. I think it's more this is more any blame in this show is usually directed at me, and well deserved for that. But I want to thank all the fans for tagging along. We've got reporters all over the country chiming in from training camp, so be sure to be following everyone on our Facebook pages and on our Twitter to make sure you're getting up to date clips and highlights and excellent analysis for people like Randy, and maybe mediocre analysis for someone like myself. But we're so thankful you guys keep reading our stuff, and we will see you soon as we get closer to week 1 hitting in September. See you guys.